Welcome to EDO Breakthrough, the podcast where we tackle economic development challenges head on. From small towns to bustling cities, every place has its own hurdles to overcome. The EDO Breakthrough podcast creates an environment of collaboration, innovation, and understanding where we can share our real-life challenges and brainstorm solutions. I'm your host, Sandy Dubé, a certified economic developer and founder of PPR Strategies. Each week, we'll be welcoming a different, brilliant, place-based mind to talk through real-life economic development challenges that have been shared with us by you, our gracious listeners. I'm here today with Dane Carlson. Dane is the host of his own podcast, Econ Dev Show, and CEO of Sitehunt. Dane, I'd love to just dive in. We can chalk these two things apart because I think they're very different. Let's talk a little bit about the Econ Dev Show first.
Well, thank you, Sandy. I guess the Econ Dev Show is a podcast and newsletter for, as its name sort of explains, for economic developers. It came about, I think it was 21, 22. We were in the midst of COVID, so probably 21. And my middle son, he has a very sort of unique form of childhood cancer. And so he was getting radiation treatment during COVID. And I had to sit in the car. And it was every day for, 2 months or something. We had to drive there. And I sat in the car and, I'm listening to podcasts and thinking about, just life in general, the fragility of life. And I got to thinking that I missed meeting with other economic developers. I missed talking to other economic developers because, it's that connection. It's what we're doing right now that makes life worth living. And I thought, you know what? I've always listened to podcasts and I like to talk to groups. I don't like to, listen to myself speak, but I like to talk. And the only thing I like more than talking is listening to other people. And I thought, you know what, this could be really good. And so I, after, I don't know exactly when it was. I think it was probably, I know I started the newsletter right about the time of the Texas freeze when we lost power and, we froze to death in our homes in Texas in the middle of COVID. But the podcast came very shortly thereafter. And it was basically, I emailed people and said, hey, do you want to be on the podcast? And literally nobody said no, which I thought was a very positive development. And I got some guests lined up and I loaded up Riverside like we're in now. And I recorded. And then I didn't listen to a single episode that I did other than to edit it a little bit. But I didn't listen to an episode for probably 6 months afterwards because I was just so self-conscious about my own voice, how it would present and all of that. And yet people started to listen and, here we are.
It's so funny. I started giggling a little bit. You talking about how you didn't listen to your own voice. This is my second podcast. I had done one also during COVID that was very local. I did one called The Frederick Factor, and it was about the community and kind of what makes this community that we were living in so unique and so awesome. And so I wanted to interview different, underrepresented entrepreneurs and business leaders and things like that. And so it was fun, but I never listened to an episode.
No, absolutely not.
I just couldn't do it.
It's absolutely awful. And I feel so bad for the guests when they come on because, they're so nervous. And, sometimes I'm more nervous than they are, but at the beginning, I was definitely 100 times more nervous than they were. And so I can just only imagine what that must be like. But yeah, I didn't listen to a single episode for months. I had eventually my kids listen, my wife listened, and they said, it's okay. You should listen. And so one day we were going somewhere, we were all in the car and I listened and it was just, it was heartbreaking to listen to myself because, in any endeavor you do, you want to be excellent at it. And you know that you can be excellent and you know that there are people who are excellent, but you know that you're not excellent yet. And that sort of, distance between that gulf between where you want to be and where you are is and can be very I don't know, it can be two things. It can be very limiting, right? You can be afraid of that you're never going to get there, but it can also be sort of encouraging and powerful in that it, drives you forward and makes you get better and makes you do it. And so I think the great thing about podcasting is literally it's us talking. We don't have to do anything. I haven't prepped for this episode. I don't know what prep you did, but we can just sit and talk. And the more we do this, the more we look at the camera, the more we look at each other, the more all of those kinds of things, take place, the better we get. And, it's something that honestly, I'm a huge proponent that every economic developer, everyone in any industry that involves communicating with other people, interacting with other people, you need to have a podcast because it's such a phenomenal method of communicating because it's right into the ears. I listen to you, you listen to me. We feel like we know each other even before we've ever met. Where else can you get that?
Yeah, you're right. It's a little stalker-like when you put it that way, but I totally get it, and I agree with you. I had somebody maybe a year or so ago, I think it was about a year ago, after the Frederick Factor podcast, when I was the host, I decided I wanted to host it for one season. I wanted the podcast to live on, but I wanted to bring in another host. So I brought in another host, and I did listen to all of her episodes, which was great. But then I did a workshop about a year ago, and I encouraged others, just like you did, to talk about why people should be podcasting and talking and doing this thing. And I confessed, just like I did to you, that I have yet to listen to an episode. And I had a woman in the workshop say, Sandy, no, you need to listen. You need to listen to yourself. You need to be constantly learning and growing and developing. And I was like, ooh, I got literally called out. And so I've taken this through a different perspective of, again, kind of self-improvement. But I can tell you it is really hard. I don't love listening to myself. I don't know who does. So I'm just glad that we don't actually capture the videos. It's just audio, and I can still make all the faces that I can make on camera. But and I listen at 1.5. I think you listen at 2 times speed.
Oh, at least, yes. I listen. Yeah, I listen so fast, which is hard because then when we're doing the podcast, I have to learn to speak slower so that it, isn't overwhelming. Yes, because I know people do listen. And that's the great thing about podcasts, because here we can have this conversation, maybe it lasts a half an hour, and yet, you can listen to it in 15 or 20 minutes without any trouble and get everything you need. And, or you can sort of time it so it's perfect for your commute, or it's perfect for your chore that you're doing, or your walk, or whatever it is. Where else can you do that? Everything else, you're on somebody else's schedule.
Yeah. Yeah. So what prompted this podcast for us was, I love helping others with their professional development journey, and I'm very passionate about it. So I wanted to create a platform where people could submit questions. They could submit them online, through social, through our website. If they are very verbal themselves, they could record and leave a voice memo on our website that we would then receive, and a question that we could answer here. And so that's been fun, collecting other people's questions. And as we're recording this I will timestamp it, which I should never do, but I will timestamp this one to say that the election is tomorrow. We are November 4th today, 2024, and people are always asking about dealing with changes in their leadership, in their boss, in economic development. And I know you've worked in public, private, quasi organizations and entities and things like that. I'm curious your experience and kind of some of your thoughts. I don't care how you vote. I'm just curious of your thoughts on a change in leadership in economic development.
Absolutely. And economic developers, I think we're especially attuned to this. And if we're not, it's because we haven't experienced it yet. But typically we work for boards, or some group of people, or what have you. And it's very, very important to be mindful of the fact that you're reporting to a board, and that board can and will change, right? I've been in situations where I worked for a board, the board was great, and I had a great rapport with that board. and we were all on the same page. We were all moving in the same direction. And then come January, there was a brand new board with all new people, none of whom I had ever worked with. And our job in economic development is to sort of build consensus and drive everyone forward in the same direction and work with the ideas that come up out of our communities and in all of this. And the same is true for our boards. We have to sit down and we all have to come to some kind of agreement, which means that some opinions, some ideas are going to be left behind and sort of de-emphasized, while others are going to, take on new significance. And the same is true wherever you are, however you do it. You just have to be able to continuously march forward. And, for economic developers today, tomorrow, things could be radically different, whether it's in your own community or it's, at the national, international level. Things are going to change. And yet we still have a job of making our communities better for our residents, making it a better, that cliche thing, live, work, and play, better place to do all those things. But it's a better place. And, our communities are counting on us to do this, to, increase the number of jobs, to now do all these things that we never had to do as economic developers, like workforce and housing and childcare and, all these things. And yet we still have to continue to do this regardless of how our board changes, how elected officials change, how the president changes, all of that stuff. And so, yeah, I think that's timely and I think that's good. And I think it's really important to remember that you work with what you have, because what you have today isn't necessarily what you're going to have tomorrow, but you have to be there and you have to be able to put in the time with the people, regardless of what it looks like, so that, your community can thrive.
Yeah, I think that the different makeups and this idea of not knowing who your stakeholders and different players are and the role that they play. And you're right, somebody that is, currently a resident or a student tomorrow could be an elected official and or a board member. And
right, could be your boss tomorrow.
Yes.
Right, exactly.
Yes. So it is interesting. I'll never forget. I don't think, and you'd said, we know once we've experienced it, but yes, when I experienced my first boss getting let go of their job, and it causes you to maybe to think twice, or to lean in. Either it's going to cause you to be a little bit more cautious, or it's going to cause you to just throw it all out there and, not look back and do what you think is right, regardless of all of the other noise that's happening around you.
Oh, yeah, I know, exactly. And especially in an industry like economic development, where things are sort of planned out and they're methodical and they're, you have long range plans and you have goals that are multi-quarter long and all of that. And yet then something like this happens and suddenly things speed up and they go really quickly. And that can be upsetting. It can be, it can be challenging, I think, for economic developers sometimes. But you just have to maintain and just keep doing it. Just keep doing the work, keep putting in the time. And remember that who your boss is today isn't necessarily who your boss will be tomorrow. What the board's makeup today is won't necessarily remain the same. Just keep plugging away. Just keep doing the work.
I'm curious. You had mentioned, I want to go back to your podcast a little bit. And I'm curious how that did start. Were you literally making cold calls to people or sending emails like cold, hey, I've started this thing? Or were you going to friends? Did you keep it really safe at first with friends and colleagues?
Oh gosh, no. So I started the newsletter first. So I had put out a few issues of the newsletter first. And one of the things that I did was I reported, if you want to call it reporting, I wrote about everyone who got their CECD one year. And so for the podcast, all I did was I sent a LinkedIn message to everyone on that list and said, hey, I'm starting this podcast. You're newly certified by the IEDC. Would you like to be on the show? And, most people didn't respond. I didn't get any no's, but most people didn't respond. But I got a couple of yeses. And so I didn't know them from Adam. I didn't know who they were. I didn't, know anything about them necessarily. But honestly, I wasn't going to go to friends first, because going to friends is almost as bad as listening to your own podcast, because heck, they could tell you that you're not any good.
That's funny. I like that method of invitation. That's pretty cool. I've been a little bit, I don't know, I'd probably say 50-50 safe versus new, maybe even actually just 25% safe of, people that I knew before and then just, risked it and put it out there as a thing. So
Well, do you record in person or do you record online mostly? Which one
online.
do you do?
We are exclusively online. I have all the technology to do in person, but I don't know, and haven't gone there yet.
Well, I recorded one episode in person, and it was a really great episode, but honestly, it was more trouble than it was worth, it seemed like. I mean, there were so many technical challenges and all of that. And, obviously I had no idea what I was doing, but for the most part, I record online and, mostly with people that I don't know, even to this day. I mean, I know them a little bit, maybe more now. And of course, they've listened to me, so they have some idea who I am. But no, for the most part, it's still, I just try to hit up strangers, because I think that's the whole thing about this idea of conversational marketing. Having a conversation with somebody allows you to just sort of call them up and say, hey, you want to be on the show? And they say, nobody ever says, no, I don't want to be on a podcast. No, I don't want to promote this thing I'm doing. No, I don't want to tell you how great my community is. I don't know. It seems to work.
If they do, they might be on the wrong job.
That's right. That's exactly the case.
Oh, fun. So let's shift gears. Okay, so you got a newsletter, you got a podcast, and if that wasn't enough, decided to, I guess, channel your inner economic developer and how can I help solve the need? Talk to me about Sitehunt.
Sure, absolutely. So, for the last 5 years, previously, I was the director of economic development for Galveston County, Texas. And in Texas, counties don't do economic development. Cities do economic development. So my job was to, help the city land and close projects. And I saw time and time again that especially in our smaller communities, the ones that were in the path of predictable growth, but, weren't, major cities yet. They were going to be, but they weren't. They didn't know what their assets were. They didn't know what properties they had. They didn't know what buildings they had available. Literally, they'd get an RFI from the state or from a site selector or a developer, and they would go to LoopNet and they would try to, sort of search and find a property. And then they would sit down and try to fill out the RFI document. And if you've ever seen an RFI from a site selector, it could have somewhere between 5 and, 1,000 questions. And what the site selector spent 10 minutes putting together, they had it in a file, they used it again, or they, wrote down the 5 criteria they were looking for, might take the economic developer anywhere from a few hours to a few days or even weeks to sort of collect and figure out and decide if they want to submit this site. And the truth is, probably 90% of the time, you're going to submit an RFI and it's going to disappear into some nether somewhere, and you're not going to win, right? Your site was never right for it anyway. So I thought, well, how can we figure out a way that we can make it possible for economic developers to A, know their sites, and B, fill out these RFIs faster, with less work, so they could get on with their life and they could get on with doing everything else they need to do, because their bosses need to see, these boards that we talked about before need to see that they're submitting for RFIs, because that's how you win projects. And yet, if they're not going to win, they need to know that as well. They need to spend the time and the effort and the resources and the money where they can actually make a difference. So that's what I did. I built Sitehunt to solve that problem. So basically, it's a database of your sites, and it uses AI and a whole bunch of other interesting technologies to sort of enrich the data that you give it, because you, the economic developer on the ground, know more about your sites than anybody else. But there is data out there, data that site selectors and businesses can get access to. And it utilizes that information that it can pull, and it uses the AI, it thinks about it, and sort of enriches and builds this database. And then it takes that information when you get an RFI, and it can sort of answer it for you. It can figure out how your site scores, how it's going to rank, whether or not you should even bother submitting it, all that kind of stuff, all sort of automatically, magically almost. It's pretty interesting.
So I put in all of my site data. So I load it. And then when I get an RFI from a consultant, then I plug that in and say, hey, where's the match? Or is there a match?
Exactly. You put your information in. We do a lot of interesting enrichment on the back end, and the AI does stuff. And then, you put it in, it scores it for you and spits out the results. So if you're looking for a 100,000 square foot building, and it has to have, water and sewage and electricity and, all those kinds of requirements, it just analyzes and figures it out. And the interesting thing is there's a lot of data out there, because you as the economic developer on the ground might know that old Joe's trying to sell this property on the edge of town, but his kids are fighting about it, so they haven't listed it with the broker. So you can't pull that on LoopNet. But that data is out there somewhere, and you have access to some of it, and these databases and the AI has access to other parts of it. So we just take all that, combine it, and put it together. So it's, I think it's a really interesting use of technology. I've showed it to a lot of people, and I have some clients now. So people obviously think it's working. So I think we're onto something.
That's great. It's, I love using technology for good like that and for efficiencies. And I think that right now, ChatGPT has taken over, the kind of capitalized the market on AI, and it's not fair. They did some, fun branding with their launch and everything, but now, there are truly appropriate tools, AI related and powered tools out there to help us all try to work a little bit more efficiently and actually get all of this stuff done that we have on our lists to do.
And, there's just so many things that AI can do, but you have to use it the right way, right? You have to recognize that it's a very inexperienced intern who is very good at following directions, exact directions. And it doesn't mind being told that it did it wrong and do it again, and do it again, and do it again. And I think if we just utilize it in that way, as opposed to using it like Google or, thinking that you can just go to it and ask it questions and it'll always give you the right answers. It's definitely that data in, data out sort of idea that you give it good stuff and you'll get good stuff out. But again, you have to try over and over and over and give it the proper instructions.
Nobody's ever compared AI to an intern. And I love that because you're right. Like, if I just, sit the intern in the corner and don't really pay attention and like take the work, but don't give them any feedback, then I'm just going to end up getting the same crap that, I would have otherwise. And
For sure.
but if I can coach them and, work with them and either feed it new information or ask them to look at it a little bit differently, oh my gosh. Interesting. I love interns and I love AI, but so you've just merged two of them for me in a way.
That's interesting that you say that, because you kind of just, I've always struggled with interns. It's funny, in that I obviously didn't do these things that I'm making the AI do now. So maybe next time I have an intern, I should do this. I should give them more instruction. I should give them more information, ask them to look at things in a different way, right? So yes, this is good. Yeah. I think using AI has probably been good for me. It's going to make me a better manager.
I think it will. It's good. And I mean, heck, even, kids, we haven't talked about kids in this conversation,
for sure. Right. Exactly.
You started a little bit with your son, which was beautiful. And thank you for sharing that story. Is he doing better? Can I ask that?
Yes, he is. He's, I guess, I don't know how to say it. He's fine currently. The cancer that he has is you have it forever, but he's fine. He lives a relatively normal life that is not horribly impacted by it, but it's a very tragic. It's a very tragic experience, and I wouldn't wish it upon anyone. It's brought us all closer together and all of that. But yeah, he lives a normal life. Let's just put it that way.
Good. Well, I think that your takeaway of connections is fun and beautiful and hopeful. And I love that you did that. One of the things that we do on our team, it just triggered, was we do what we call 8 weeks, 8 weeks of something. So a couple of years ago during the pandemic, we did 8 weeks of giving. And this year we're doing 8 weeks of connections. And we do it the last 8 weeks of the calendar year. And we put out a blog, a newsletter, blog post every day, or every week, excuse me, not every day, every week for the next 8 weeks. And each one, everybody on my team gets to write something about how they are interpreting their connections. And mine published today, and it was 8 weeks of connections. And I actually reached out to my very first intern. So funny that we're having this conversation about interns. But yeah, she interned with me. Oh gosh, back I think in 2002. So 22 years ago. I was working out of my house. She came into my house and worked all summer long, and she was delightful. We've stayed in touch. She now has 2 kids of her own. She's had careers. She's done things. It's been awesome. But I love that connection and reaching out and your kind of takeaway with your son and family and professional contacts and stuff like that was cool too.
Well, you mentioned that son and family and professional context. It's so interesting because, for most of my career, I worked at home. I was a professional blogger when blogging was a thing before we ruined the internet with all the blog spam and, all of that. From 2001 to 2015, I was a professional blogger, and my wife homeschooled the children. So we have 3 boys, and they're 16 to 22. So she homeschooled them all. I worked at home. We lived most of that time we lived in the middle of nowhere. It was, it was a great life. It was phenomenal, but everything was intertwined: life, work, children, family, everything was just all sort of mixed up together. And it was a lot of fun.
That does sound pretty awesome, actually. So as I'm curious, as we kind of come to the end of this, you said you didn't prepare. So I am curious if you thought like, oh my gosh, I sure hope that Sandy asks me such and such. Did you, was there anything that you were dying to talk about today?
Oh gosh, no, I was just hopeful that you didn't make me go back and promise to listen to myself on this episode. That as long as we don't have to do that, I'm totally fine.
No, I would never do that to you. I would never do that to you.
Thank you. I will promote it. I will absolutely tell other people to listen to it, but I cannot guarantee you that I will listen to this episode.
I get it. It's all good. It's all good. So one of the last questions that we like to ask our guests is, what was your EDO breakthrough? And you can interpret that however you like.
Well, interesting. I think, let's, I guess we can kind of bring this back to Sitehunt. And that's to recognize that the difference between a piece of raw land and a vacant building and an economic development asset that you can market and sell is literally just information. If you have data about a site, you can market and sell that, because even if the data is bad, even if there is a toxic waste dump in the middle of your property, you can sell that as an economic development asset if you have that information, because businesses rely upon information. They need the data so they can build it into their models. Is this going to be profitable? Do we have the money to remediate this? Do we have all that kind of stuff? But only if they have the data. If they have the data, they can do it. We can find the right customer. And so I think that's the most important thing to recognize, that it doesn't matter what the data says as long as you have the data.
Nice. This has been fun. I think that we could go off into so many different tangents, and I'm holding back so that we don't go
I
off
totally
into...
I totally understand,
Yes.
right? We're going to lose listeners at 30 minutes. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I hope you stuck around. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any additional questions, please, reach out to me, reach out to Dane. And with that, I'd like to just say thank you, Dane. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Sandy. This has been fun.
The EDO Breakthrough podcast is brought to you by PPR Strategies. PPR Strategies, standing for People and Places Reimagined, is a strategic consulting firm working specifically with EDOs and other place-based organizations. We share the unique stories of communities through communication, strategic planning, marketing, media relations, and more. Visit us at pprstrategies.com and find our contact information in the show notes. I'd like to give a big thank you to you for listening. Remember, together we are unstoppable.